I'm assuming that if you have some awareness of who the Rebbe is, the Rebbe's life, from earliest childhood, he was a book person. His whole life was books. As a young child, it was only books of Torah. And beginning in his adolescence, the Rebbe showed an interest in all areas of knowledge. There's an expose, an account written by a Jew who was not Orthodox, not religious, who knew the Rebbe from his hometown, who became a big macher later on in Israel, and he wrote a whole thing mostly about the Rebbe's younger brother, who was was an acquaintance of the Rebbe's younger brother. And in this account, which is published, you can read it, he writes that Mendel, that was the Rebbe, Mendel, he was 16 or 17 years old, predicted that on this and this date there'd be a solar eclipse. He studied astronomy all by himself, and he did his own calculations, and he predicted a solar eclipse. And we knew that Mendel can't make a mistake. And the day comes, the day goes, and there's no solar eclipse, and we were all disappointed. Mendel made a mistake. And this is a written, he's describing how the kids, they were teenagers, were saying, no, Mendel didn't make a mistake. There's something wrong with the newspaper. There was a whole debate. And then a week or two later, they discovered that there was an eclipse in Brazil. So Mendel wasn't wrong. So this person he wrote this, I don't know when he wrote this, in the 70s probably. It's really more about the Rebbe had a younger brother, his name was Label, who he was a personal friend of his. Leib died very young, at age 1952, he was less than 50. But in this expose, he mentions Mendel, our Rebbe. So from quite an early age, the Rebbe showed an interest in all things. I have an acquaintance, a friend, who told me that he had a great uncle who roomed with the Rebbe. He roomed with the Rebbe. They slept in they shared a room. In other words, they rented a studio apartment. They couldn't afford to pay rent for themselves, so they shared it. He says, I almost never saw him. When I slept, he wasn't there. When he slept, I wasn't there. They kept different hours. But there was the big joke, because the Rebbe was always busy finding out new stuff. He says he walks into the apartment, and the Rebbe was sitting and studying shorthand, how to write in shorthand. So this Yid, his name is Nimaitin, Fala Nimaitin, Raphael Nimaitin, says to, we have Nimaitin in town here? Okay, Fala Nimaitin, so it's somehow related. Says to the Rebbe, what are you wasting your time on now? Pardon me? So the Rebbe says to him in Yiddish, Das wird mir euch zu nütz kommen. One day this will serve me well also. The Rebbe wanted to know everything, and he had the kind of brain to absorb everything. The Rebbe spent many, many years studying. I want you to know he did very good in one way and terrible in another way. He had great grades, just never came to school. When he was doing polytechnic work, in other words, postgraduate work. So they wrote they've published these things. All of his transcripts say he's a great student, he just never comes to school. In other words, he knew the material, but he never sat in the classes. He needed to know everything. But he was a Jew. His life was religion, God, faith. So when he was already a big Rebbe, everybody knew about Rabbi Schneerson. So a man asked him directly, point blank, how could a person with your intellect believe in God? How could a person as smart as you believe in God? And people have said that when you talk to the Rebbe about medicine, he sounded like a doctor. You talk to him about politics, this is a dirty one, he sounded like a politician. You talk to him about military matters, he sounded like a general. You talk to him about God, he sounded like a child. As a klein kid, his faith was not complicated. There's a Jew that I knew years and years ago. He told us, his name was Yehuda Landis, Judd Landis. He was a psychiatrist. He lived in Palo Alto. He's now deceased. So he once said in a public speech that he grew up in Brooklyn. He grew up in Crown Heights. But he was completely secular. He says, I could have gone into the Rebbe in 1952. I could have spent an hour with him. Instead, he went off to fight the Korean War and became a psychiatrist. He met Chabad as an adult. He says he was already married with children when he decided that maybe religion serves a purpose. He was a psychiatrist. He was a brain person. Not a brain person that he was smart. He was studying people's brains. And he decided that maybe religion is not a bad idea. So he says, when I decided that religion is not a bad idea, I began to shop for a rabbi. Now, how is a secular Jew supposed to shop for a rabbi? How can a person who knows nothing about religion shop for a rabbi? He says, I had one question. It's such a great chap. It's brilliant. He says, I would meet rabbis of all different stripes, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, and I would ask him one question. Do you believe in God? And he had a stopwatch. He'd push the watch, and he'd time how long the answer took. So the average length of the answer was between 3 and 5 minutes. It depends. There are certain conditions, not sure, not exactly, and you have to know what it means. Anyway, he met a Chabad rabbi. He says, do you believe in God? Before he could push the watch, the guy said, yeah. So I had my rabbi. That was it. Because he knew that a rabbi's got to believe in God. That much he knew. Beyond that, he didn't know much. But a rabbi has to believe in God, and as the old expression is, what do you say about religion? What do you say about religion? You don't mess with it. Religion, you leave it alone. You either believe, you don't believe, you practice, you don't believe, don't mess with it. So, this man says to the Rebbe, how could a person as intelligent as you believe? And he believed like a child. So the Rebbe gave him a brilliant answer. I think it's a great answer. The Rebbe said to him, it's a different skill set. It's a different skill. Faith is a different skill set. In other words, if you believe that faith is the end of logic and reason, you probably never get to the end. You're always busy spinning your wheels, But if you appreciate that faith is separate from logic, it's simple. The way I explain it, this is not the Rebbe talking, this is me talking now. The way I explain it is, would you consider an artist an intellectual? Are artists intelligent? Some are and some aren't. Would you consider musicians intellectuals? Are musicians are people who are skilled with the musical arts smart or not smart? The answer is, doesn't make a difference. They're talented. They have their skill set. So the Rebbe said, faith is not the end of reason. It's separate from reason. It's a separate thing. It's a whole other story. It's a different part of the brain, a different part of the soul. Unfortunately, so many of us are so preoccupied with our brain that to get to God from a brain, you got to have a brain like Abraham's, which means you got to be really, really, really smart. For most of us, if you use your brain to get to God, you get stuck. You're busy. You're busy running around in that I don't know what you want to call it, that Ferris wheel of uncertainty, and same questions, same answers, same uncertainties. You go around and around and around. It never finishes. But if you appreciate that faith is separate from reason, you could be the smartest guy in the world. You really could be. You could be the smartest guy in the world and have the simplest faith. The Rebbe met a lot of smart people. The Rebbe met a lot of smart people. The Rebbe was a smart guy, met a lot of smart people. And the Rebbe never argued with them. Not about God, never. There was a man who, by the way, I would encourage you to get his books. His name is Velvel Green. He's now deceased. Professor Velvel Green. He wrote a number of little books. He was a biologist. He did a lot of very cool things in his career as a scientist. But he wrote a couple of books. Unfortunately, the most important book he ever wrote is written in Hebrew, and I think it's a sin, because the book must be in English. But he has a number of books in English where he presents his relationship with the Rebbe over the course of his life. He met the Rebbe in 1962. In 1962, you met the Rebbe, he sat with you for hours, especially a person like that. So his story with the Rebbe is, when he met the Rebbe the first time, the Rebbe said, I want to ask you a personal favor. I want you to take a notebook. This is a scientist, this is a real scientist. I want you to take a notebook. And any time you see the hand of God in your life, what we call hashgacha pratis, divine providence, write it down. Anytime something happens in your life which is fortuitous, that it shouldn't have happened statistically, that somebody orchestrated, write it down. The Rebbe didn't argue with him, didn't have conversations, didn't debate. Proof God, yeah proof, no proof, yeah God, no God. The Rebbe said, when you see God in your life, write it down. Now, so if you're a smart guy, and everything is causal for you, cause and effect, what's the proof? And what's the process? But you see God. You don't understand why, you don't understand how, but you see God. If you make a record of that, you develop an ability to believe in God even though your brain isn't there. Intellectually, you're someplace else. You see, that's the whole thing. You don't necessarily have to understand your relationship with God. You must have the relationship. You must have the relationship. This is one of the gifts of the Rebbe. I like to say that that's what tzaddikim do. Rabbis teach Talmud, rabbis teach law. Holy people give us God. They don't give us God in our mind, they give us God in our soul. Meeting the Rebbe was meeting, I can't say meeting the Rebbe was meeting God. But meeting the Rebbe made God very real, because he was so real to him. And I want to share this also, that on this day, where we're engaging with the Rebbe gave people God. The Rebbe gave the smartest people in the world, some really, really smart guys. He gave them a relationship with God. I'll tell you a story, which I love. I'm going to say l'chaim. Right? Say l'chaim, I'll tell you a story. Thank you. L'chaim, everybody. L'chaim v'levracha. L'chaim, l'chaim, l'chaim v'levracha. L'chaim, l'chaim, l'chaim. There was a rabbi, a gid. He was 18 years old. He was a genius. He was very smart. He was a very, very smart kid. He's very in the Talmudic scholarly world. He's one of the most famous personalities the last 150 years. His name was Joseph, and his family name was Rosen. He's known in the scholarly world of smart Jews as the genius of Rogachev or Rogachev, depending on how you pronounce it in Russian. He was a brilliant man, had a great, great mind, and he absorbed the whole Talmud, the entire Talmud, like a sponge. And he was the Rebbe's teacher. The Rebbe used to quote him. Our Rebbe would quote him all the time. He was one of the most original thinkers in Talmud in the last 3 centuries, probably. When he was 18 years old, he knew the whole Torah. He knew everything that was published. And he decided to check out if anybody else knows anything. You know, imagine you're a genius, right? You have a classmate that's a genius. I had a classmate that was a genius. We all hated him. Why? Because he made sure we never forgot that he was a genius, right? He was obnoxious. He was a nitnick. So the poor guy he was just he just wanted to know what you knew. I had a classmate. I'm talking when I was 11 years old, 12 years old. He used to read the encyclopedia like this column like this, and turn the page, and we all thought he was making jokes, and we would test him. He knew every word. He was a genius. Now he's a big Chabad rabbi, but then he was a genius, and we beat up on the poor guy because he was obnoxious. So this Yosef Rosen was obnoxious. He went from town to town. He went into the rabbi in each shtetl, to the biggest Talmudist, and he would start talking to him, and within 15 minutes he was mopping the floor with the guy. Rabbis in there with white beards, 3 times his age, 4 times, they knew nothing. He knew more than all of them. He was really very bright. And this is what he did. He went from place to place. And every once in a while he met a rabbi who was also bright. You know, he wasn't the only genius. You know, Jews are blessed with more than one genius. They're all obnoxious, but there's more than one. I don't mean that, but you know what I'm saying. It's not fair, so we make it even by making fun of it. We could have a conversation about that. But anyway, he would meet a rabbi who really was bright. And when you meet a rabbi who was as smart as he was, they would fight like lions, like 2 bull elephants. They'd smash into each other. The whole... people describe the Rebbe, our Rebbe, talking to other geniuses. They'd stand in the hallway of 770. They wouldn't quote. They'd quote page numbers. It's like 2 computers talking to each other. You stood and observed what they were doing. You had no idea what was going on, because they didn't quote passages. They didn't say that. They just quoted a page. You know, Tamura 16b. No, B'chayda is 11a, and Bracha is 47b in the Tosfos. And this is like it's a different language. So this genius, this 18-year-old genius Rogachev, came to a town, and he met a rabbi. He came to the city of Lublin. Lublin always had great rabbis. And he met a rabbi who was 3 times his age, who was an old man. And they started to fight, to have this Talmudic fisticuffs. And they were arguing for hours. He was a match for him. And they argued and they debated and they threw pages of Gemara at each other. Anyway, when he walked out of this rabbi's house, he was dizzy. He was dazed. He was overwhelmed. And they heard him as he walked through the streets of Lublin. He was muttering to himself. He spoke in Yiddish. He says, "Der Alte can learn. That old man can learn. That old man is smart." So before he left this rabbi's house, this old rabbi's house, he said to this old rabbi, "Is there anybody else in Lublin worth my time? You met me. You see I'm a pretty smart guy. I'm also an arrogant guy. Is there anybody else in Lublin I should bother go speaking to?" He says, "Yeah." Lublin had a Rav, had a rabbi, and Lublin had a Rebbe, had a Hasidic Rebbe. The rabbi was a great genius, and the Rebbe was a holy man who gave out cake, you understand, and herring. But this Rebbe who gave out cake and herring also was a great master, was a great genius, knew much Torah. He says, "You want to speak to somebody else in Lublin that can match you page for page and book for book and bookcase for bookcase, go into the Rebbe of Lublin." His name was Reb Tzadok HaKohen. The Rav of Lublin was Shnei Zalman Fratkin, the Torah's Chassid. The names don't mean that much to you. They frankly don't mean that much to me either. It's a long time ago. This is the seventh. But the Rebbe of Lublin, he's very popular in the Hasidic world. Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin. Go into him, you can talk to him. He's a genius. He's a Rebbe, he's a big tzaddik, but he's also a great Talmudist. So this 18-year-old genius goes across town, he goes into the Lubliner Rebbe. He comes into his room, and the Lubliner Rebbe is sitting with his hands folded, looking at him like as if he's a monkey. And his genius, the Rogachev, throws a page at him. He starts to quote Talmudic passages. He's goading him. He wants to create the framework for a good fight. They're going to have two supercomputers are going to clash, which is his delight. That was his pleasure. And Reb Tzadok HaKohen is looking at him. And he quotes one page, he quotes a second page, he quotes a third page, and he's looking at him. I'm not playing. I'm not playing. You know, the rabbi of Lublin fought with you. I'm not in for this game. So he sits with his hands folded, and this 18-year-old genius is throwing pages at him. He quotes one passage, a second passage. He's trying to get him agitated. He wants to get him to move into a space where he'll want to engage. And then they can have fun. They can argue. And the Rebbe, the holy Rebbe, Tzadok HaKohen, is sitting and looking at him. And he's quoting page after page after page, but eventually he realizes that he's not playing. The Lubliner Rebbe, as opposed to the Lubliner Rav, the Lubliner Rebbe, as opposed to the Lubliner Rabbi, is not playing the game. Okay, so he stops. So when he finishes trying to goad him into an argument, the Lubliner Rebbe says, "I think in these words you can encapsulate the whole Chassidus." I'm going to say it in Yiddish. You'll forgive me for the Yiddish. I'll translate it in the English. He says, "Dem junger Mann, ich bin euch einmal gewesen azoi wie du. Gefahren über der Welt gewesen, als keiner kann nicht lernen. Aber es ist nicht kein Leben. Geh gefind sich erheben. Soll der Reus lernen, wie mit Avdin and the Meibishten." You understand Yiddish? You gotta learn Yiddish for this. He says, "Young man, I was once just like you. I ran around and showed everybody that they're all stupid. I'm smarter than everybody. I'm the smartest guy in the world." And he was the smartest guy in the world. But that's not life. That's not life. Find yourself a Rebbe who will teach you how to connect to God. That's what he said. Find yourself a Rebbe. You say you're a smart guy. Big deal. A lot of smart people. But smart is a gift from God. What makes us a mensch? I'm smarter than the next guy. What makes me a mensch is to have a relationship with God. Find yourself a Rebbe. Let him teach you how to serve God. That's the story. It's the whole story. It's the whole story. And that's the Rebbe. The Rebbe met all kinds of people. You know, he met smart people and simple people. You know, some of the people the Rebbe met were very bright. A lot of people that Rebbe met were, how do we say it, kind of ordinary, right? But for all of them, his message was the same, basically. Obviously, a smarter person needs a different message in terms of the details. But the message was, we need a relationship with God. I'll tell you a story. I got to tell you a story. Okay, now they're bothering me to finish the Fabrengen. So now I'm in the mood of Fabrengen. That's how this works. I'll tell you one story, then I'll stop. Eine Minute, Palakasha. I used to teach a Tanya class in Flatbush in Brooklyn. There's a place called New York, and New York has a borough called Brooklyn, and Brooklyn has a sub-borough called Flatbush, and I would give a Tanya class in this neighborhood in Brooklyn. I gave this class, by the way, if you visit InsideChassidus.org, all those classes that I gave in that shul are online. The class went on maybe for 7 or 8 years, but the crowd would move in and out. You know, every year or two, the other people, the old people got bored of me, and I got new people who would join the class. I had my geek period. I had like a period with like 8 or 9 people, a bunch of engineers, right? What's the first sign of an engineer? He's got a bunch of pens in his pocket. What's the second sign of an engineer? There's got ink in the bottom of the lower part of his shirt because he forgets to close the button. What can I tell you? They're all the same, right? I'm also an engineer some days. That's why I use a cap rather than a button-down pen, because they don't leak. It took me like 20 years to figure that out. So I'm an engineer too, at least in the sense of being absent-minded. So I had my engineer period. A bunch of really, they were smart, they were all smarter than me. Brilliant people. I remember I asked one of them to explain to me how they figured out in the 1870s, Faraday figured out the speed of light. How do you figure out the speed of light in the 1880s? He tried to explain it to me, and after 2 seconds, I said, you know what? I lost you. Don't even bother. I don't know what you're talking about. He tried to explain it to me, and I was just gone. So it was a guy whose name was Morris. His Hebrew name was Moshe. And he wore a yarmulke on his head that you could see he wore it exactly once a week. You know what they call an ice cream cone yarmulke? You know, when it doesn't fit right, you know it's not there often enough. He came every week with his navy blue shirt with an ink stain in the lower right corner of his shirt, and he never said a word. Now the class didn't have 400 students, it had about 6 students, you understand? So I had time to get to know him. So I said to this Morris, who are you? He told me he's in Nigeria, he worked for the city, he was working on bridges. He explained what he was doing, really cool stuff. This is Brooklyn, this is not Orlando. Kid grew up in Brooklyn, he never had a Passover Seder. I didn't know it happened. Pesach, never had a Pesach Seder. When I invited him to come to Pesach Seder, he didn't know what it was. I said, you grew up in Brooklyn? He says, yeah, right here in whatever neighborhood it was. But somehow you could live in Brooklyn, you know, the holiest of holies of America, and still not know that Pesach you got to have a Seder, and Hanukkah you got to light candles. But he came to my Tanya class every week. So I said to him, Morris, you come here every week. He never said a word, never questioned what I said, never doubted what I said. I'm sure he had so many issues with what I was saying. I mean, I'm stupid now. I was stupider then. You know, I get every day I know a little less than I know the day before, and the less I know, the smarter I am, the wiser I am. It's just a fact of life. This goes back 10 years, 12 years. I was a bigger know-it-all then than I am now. I still know it all, but I know less of all. So I said to Morris, I said, why do you come to these classes? What are you doing here? He says, I want a relationship with God. Those are his words. I want a relationship with God. I never heard an adult person ever say to me, I want a relationship, but especially a scientist. So I was a bit taken aback. I want a relationship with God. So I immediately said to him, listen, you are an engineer. And he knew a lot of mathematics. He was a really smart guy. I said, if you want a relationship with God, then you must have figured out all the problems with God. You know, people have problems with God. If the world is this and this old, and this and this and this and this and this and this and this, we're not sure exactly where God fits into the equation. In the 19th century, there's the famous quote, in my model, there's no need for God. So I said to this Morris, I said to this Moshe, I said, if you're coming to a Tanya class where we talk about God and you're interested in a relationship with God, then you must have worked out all the science. You must have figured out all the problems. I know the universe and the strata. There's a lot of questions. So I said to him, you must have figured all the stuff out. He said, no, I never thought about it. So I said to him, I don't understand. You're an engineer. You're a smart man. You're well educated. And you didn't think about the scientific problems with God. And you're here in this class where we're talking about God. And so he interrupted me. He says, Rabbi, I don't care. I want a relationship with God. Those were his words. I don't care. Now, I'm the rabbi, right? But this man taught me something. I don't care. I want a relationship with God. If you want to understand the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that's it. I don't care. I want a relationship with God. And we're going to daven mincha. Okay, that's what we got to do now. We're going to have a relationship with God.